Okay, welcome everybody to the Bergren Forum. As some of you may know, this is the 51st year in which the Bergren Forum has been going. We were planning to have a big 50th birthday cake at the final forum of the spring semester, but sadly the cake, like everything else, fell victim to the pandemic. I promise though that once we're through with social distancing and back meeting in Nevins, there will be cake. Obviously, because of the pandemic, we can't meet in Nevins as usual, and so all the presentations this semester will be, like today, conducted online through Zoom. Some of the presentations I had lined up for the fall really didn't lend themselves to the virtual format, so we decided to go with a reduced schedule for this semester, with a Bergren Forum every 2 weeks. And a minute. I wanted to show the can you see the presentation, this schedule?
We see you.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, if we've got a reduced schedule for the semester, 6 Bergren Forums, one every 2 weeks. And what we've lost in quantity, we're making up for in quality. And so let me just call attention to the next forum in 2 weeks' time, which is Mike Stone, our Network Services Administrator, giving a talk entitled Lessons from a YouTube Content Creator. Let me just mention the rules of engagement for this virtual format. As host, I'm keeping you all muted, so you won't be able to boo, hiss, and heckle in the time-honored manner. You can, however, use the chat function to raise questions or comments during the presentation. And at the end, I'll allow people to unmute themselves so people can then make more substantive comments and ask more complicated questions. And with that, let me introduce the panel for today, who are presenting on women's suffrage 100 years on. Gary Ostrower, Professor of History, Mallory Szymanski, Professor of History, Laurie McFadden, the University Archivist and Librarian, Becky Profit, Professor of Theatre, Tricia de Bertlis, the Associate Dean at the Centre for Student Involvement. That's everyone, right? So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gary.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, and welcome back to the 2020-21 academic year. We're going to be talking about the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and I want to remind you that the 19th Amendment is not the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. This is the 19th Amendment, and it received its final vote of approval, ratification process by the Tennessee legislature on August 18th of 1920, when the youngest member of the assembly, his name was Harry Byrne, acted on the advice of his mother, and well, I'm trying to get my PowerPoint here, which is not working. How come? Well, I may not have it. I don't know. Okay, there we go. His name was Harry Byrne, and he acted on the advice of his mother. He was going to vote against the against ratification. It would have been a tie vote, which would have meant it would not have passed. And based on the pressure that his mother put on him, he voted in favor of it. And so ratification carried in Tennessee by a single vote, and the 19th Amendment became an amendment to the United States Constitution. Now, I want to start at the beginning, and the beginning is the Puritan Great Migration to the United States, which begins in 1630, 10 years after the Pilgrims had arrived. And at that time, no woman in Massachusetts could vote. Adult males voted, but not even all of them. Voters had to own land, and they had to be members of a Puritan church. And women, even if church members, had zero political rights, nor did they have many other rights. Married women, for instance, didn't have even the right to keep their own name. They could not sign contracts, nor could a woman divorce her husband, even if he continually mentally abused her. All property she brought into a marriage became that of her husband. If he wanted to gamble it away, he could gamble it away. When Anne Hutchinson opened her mouth to complain about some pretty important religious matters, theological issues, they banished her from the colony. So in a political sense, women were voiceless. Women were voiceless. Whoops. Nor did this really change by the time of the Revolutionary War. And that was over a century later. But there were rumblings of change. Many colonial women joined in boycotts of British goods. They sewed flags and uniforms for the Continental Army, and these were viewed in their own way as political acts. They taught their male children the virtues of Republican government. In other words, they were inching toward a political role. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who was one of the, really most responsible for the Revolutionary War Declaration and became, of course, the second president of the United States. Abigail Adams famously wrote her husband not to forget the ladies. But he must have had a lousy memory, as did almost every other male politician at that time. Well, almost, because in New Jersey, the legislature granted women in 1776 the right to vote. And they kept that right until 1807. In fact, a 1776 law granted suffrage to, quote, all citizens. And in 1790, a few years later, it was changed to guarantee voting rights to men and women. And I mention this because the change meant that women explicitly had the right to vote. There was no oversight or no accident that somehow allowed them to vote during this period. But all that changed in the year 1807. And in 1807, when the Democratic Republican Party, that was the party of Thomas Jefferson, when the Democratic Party regained control of the New Jersey legislature and stripped women of voting rights. And you might ask, well, why did they do that? And the answer was because of a gender gap. Jersey women generally supported the rival Federalist Party, and the Democratic Republicans therefore eliminated their right to vote. Today we call this voter suppression. And that's the way things remained for decades in all of the states. You probably know that we often refer to the Jacksonian period, and that lasts from roughly 1824 until around 1844 or so. We call the Jacksonian period the age of democracy. Now, there are good reasons for this. Among other things, property qualifications for voting disappeared, and there were economic changes. Economic democracy was expanded with legislation that allowed any person, regardless of birth, regardless of wealth, to incorporate, to establish a public business. But I don't think we should get carried away. Democracy expanded, all right, but for males only, or rather for white males only. So let's call it the age of stunted democracy. But what I really want to stress is that it was this period that produced the women's movement that led directly to Seneca Falls in 1848. We celebrate Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but we need to remember that the women's movement itself preceded them. It was a product mainly of two things. Number one, an increasingly restrictive role for white middle-class women at that time. Okay, a role that stressed, as you can see here, domesticity and submissiveness. And secondly, it was a product of the abolition movement. And the connection between abolitionism and women's suffrage is a logical one. Slaves could not own property. Married women could not own property. Slaves could not sit on juries. Women could not sit on juries. Slaves could not sign contracts, nor could married women. Abolitionism captured the public imagination in the North. Perhaps it was inevitable that attention would turn to the denial of rights for women. Indeed, most of the reformers who would show up in Seneca Falls started out as abolitionists, and that included Frederick Douglass, who was one of the people who actually attended the convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. Now, I want to offer three additional thoughts. Number one, not all women who attended Seneca Falls Convention supported the idea of women's suffrage. One of the most prominent reformers, the Quaker feminist Lucretia Mott, warned against including a plank for suffrage. And the reason, she said, is that it would make us look ridiculous. And she had lots of company, even among feminists. Indeed, in 1848, support for suffrage generally was minuscule, kind of like support for gay marriage in this country, perhaps 30 years ago. Number two, I want to make the point that after the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment extended voting rights to freed slaves, it specified males only. Susan B. Anthony cried bloody murder, but many other feminists held their tongues because, as newspaper editor Horace Greeley said, this is the Negro's hour. And three, I want to mention that Anthony, who visited Alfred a few years later as she campaigned for women's suffrage, once opposed a black woman feminist speaking at a suffrage rally. In fact, the rally was a celebration of her own work. Why did she oppose the black woman speaking there? Because Anthony thought that even the presence of a black feminist, her name, by the way, was Adele Hunt Logan, even her very presence would offend white politicians. Maybe this is a kind of 19th century version of cancel culture. Now, I'm going to shift away for the next few minutes to the post-1848 period with some comments that I hope will deepen our understanding of the complexity of the story. A few years ago, when I was researching at UC Berkeley on the subject of women's suffrage, I discovered something that kind of surprised me. We think of states like Wyoming and Utah today as among the most conservative in the US. And they are among the most conservative in the US. And yet Wyoming in 1869, when it was still a territory, became the very first territory, and then the first state to enfranchise women. Huh? I mean, how do you explain this kind of thing? It almost defies understanding. And the answer is that Wyoming at that time was raw frontier. Lots of men, single men, and they were wild single men. Wyoming's political leaders sought social stability, and that called for women. And that they reasoned that women in Wyoming would mean more families in Wyoming, and they believed rightly that families would contribute to social stability. But how can they lure women to that frontier community? And the answer was, at least part of the answer was, they would guarantee women full political rights. Utah also was frontier, but Mormon frontier. Like Wyoming, it granted women the right to vote when it became an organized territory in 1870. Was that because the Mormon elders were committed to sexual equality? And the answer, of course, is you bet it was not. Their thinking was down-to-earth practical. As more and more non-Mormon males moved into the territory, the Mormons feared that they would lose political control of their own desert kingdom. Therefore, they supported women's suffrage, and they supported it because the female population, which at that time was still overwhelmingly Mormon, would therefore double. In other words, they would double the number of Mormon voters in one fell swoop. It was political magic, right? And it worked. And I want to add one wrinkle. For non-Mormon men in Utah also supported suffrage because they believed, wrongly as it turned out, that Mormon women would use their political clout to outlaw polygamy. And then California. In 1911, the 9 years, this is before the 20th Amendment was ratified, California extended suffrage to women. California male voters followed the example of Wyoming and Utah and granted women the right to vote, and here was their reasoning. It was different from those other states. California was, at that time, a drunken heaven. San Francisco, for instance, contained 10 times more bars than churches. It was also a state that was racked by political corruption. Hell, the Southern Pacific Railroad owned the state legislature, and I really mean that, I mean, kind of figuratively, but yeah, they owned it. And so male Californians signed enough petitions to hold a popular referendum for suffrage, hoping to capitalize on the general public disgust with both corruption and with the abuse of alcohol, thinking that women, if they could vote, would promote both prohibition and clean government. In other words, California progressives gambled that women voters would be their allies in a broad reform movement. By 1920, When the 19th Amendment was ratified, 19 states, including New York, had already adopted women's suffrage. And the rest, as we say, is history. Okay, Emrys, second speaker. Emrys?
Sorry, I thought you were just going to hand straight over to Mallory.
Oh, all right. Mallory, you're
I
on.
thought you were handing over to each other.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. The 19th Amendment did little to secure the right to vote for Black women. It would not be until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Black women would experience the same access to the franchise that white women got in 1920. Two things are important here. Black women were excluded from the suffrage movement and the impact of the 19th Amendment. And Black women's access to the vote was not solely a women's issue. It was intimately tied to freedom and the franchise for Black men too. To tell the story, we need to understand the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment enfranchised 500,000 Black men who voted in droves during Reconstruction for Republican candidates. They ran for office too. In Mississippi, more than half the population comprised former slaves. And in the 1870s, Black Mississippians elected Black state officials and 2 Black senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. White Southerners responded with laws and violent intimidation to curtail Black voting power. Jim Crow policies such as poll taxes and literacy tests, combined with the looming threat of lynching, kept Black voters away from the polls after 1877. As a result, in Louisiana, for example, only 0.5%, 0.5% of eligible Black men were registered to vote. Jim Crow laws had suppressed the Black vote. So of course, when Black women organized, they weren't only thinking about votes for women as white suffragists were. They were combating white supremacy and securing the right to vote for Black women and Black men. In 1913, Ida B. Wells founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. It was the first Black women's suffrage association in the United States. In Chicago, women could already vote on a limited basis by this time, and the club wished to use that foot in the door to amplify Black women's electoral power. As the National American Women's Suffrage Association planned to march on Washington on Wilson's inauguration day in 1913, Ida B. Wells and other Black suffragists traveled from Chicago to DC to be a part of it. Yet NASA leaders told them that we intend to keep our delegation entirely white. Otherwise, Southern white women would not march. Wells stood up, a tear streaming down each cheek, and said, "If the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. Either I go with you or not at all." The exclusion of Black women from the parade reflects the broader intention of the white suffragists to abandon Black women when it was politically expedient. Not only that, but some Black men, like some white men, opposed Black women's suffrage because they feared Black women voters would attempt to take the place of men and wear the trousers. Nevertheless, Wells and her club members persisted, registering voters in the face of exclusion from white suffragists and intimidation from men. Back in Chicago, Ida B. Wells and the Alpha Suffrage Club worked hard to register Black women voters. As a result of their work, voters elected the first Black city council member, Oscar DePriest, in 1915, who would go on to serve in Congress. Membership in the Alpha Suffrage Club rose as the number of lynchings increased after World War I. Drunken mobs, often of white veterans, targeted some of the 380,000 Black men who served in World War I. White vigilantes killed Black people in their homes and churches as well. In 1919, white people lynched 76 Black people. To escape violence, Black Americans moved to places like Chicago as part of the Great Migration, hoping to start families and find work. There they met racist violence in different forms. Labor unrest and segregation locked Black people in low-paying jobs. In the summer of 1919, 17-year-old Eugene Williams was murdered by a white person on a beach for crossing the line of segregation. White gangs cruised the neighborhoods of Black Chicagoans, attacked them and burned down their houses, and police looked the other way. So you can see The suffrage movement for Black women wasn't a single issue movement or a North and South movement. It was born out of a necessity to confront what historian Joan Scott calls multiple fields of force. So while many NASA women worked towards suffrage for white women as a single issue, one which, when achieved, they believed would open the door to other forms of power. For Black women, the vote was tied equally to education, employment, fair wages, safe housing, and lynching. The combination of these issues also drove the activism of Ida B. Wells and the Alpha Suffrage Club. When the 19th Amendment was written, the language was deliberately simple. The text of it says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of sex." This did nothing to redress the violence and Jim Crow laws that already existed to restrict Black men's votes. And it would make the 19th Amendment practically useless for Black women in the South. The sex-based language was a strategy to appeal to the Southern congressmen on whose support the white suffrage movement relied. Southern Democrats had seen the power of the Black electorate, and they knew that Black voters would not be voting for former Confederates and current Klansmen if they were able to vote. They had no interest in supporting an amendment that would restore and expand Black voting power in the South. The ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 was certainly a cause for some celebration among the white women it enfranchised across the US. However, Black women would agitate 45 more years. People my age at that time would have to wait until they were in their 80s to ever cast their first ballot. Thank you.
Over to Laurie.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to bring us a little bit closer to home in Alfred. So as Mallory and Gary have already said, these reform movements are interconnected. Mallory just called them the multiple fields of force, which I hadn't heard before. So we're focusing on suffrage, but it's very complex. They're all intertwined. And they were efforts to promote social justice and try to improve the human condition. So it's really hard, we can't tease them apart, but in our little section today, we're not even gonna try. But they heavily impacted each other, and the citizens of Alfred were very actively involved in all three of these reform movements. And the women, okay, sorry, now I'm not, my PowerPoint is also not advancing. Just go back and see if I can get it to. Okay, can you see that now? Okay, yay, I think we're going. So just early on, we had women in Alfred, 1886, Lucy Barber, who voted, attempted to vote, even though it was illegal. We had 10 women led by Abigail Allen that voted in an election in Alfred. The Wellsville paper said they have this, and they're well respected. They got in this position. They believe they're fully entitled to the privilege. Now, women across the state were doing very similar things because they're testing a theory that because the Constitution did not specifically deny them the right to vote, it must be implicit. So early reformers in Alfred, you know, we're out there marching and saying, listen, it doesn't say we can't, so we're gonna try. And so suffrage support in Alfred, you know, wasn't just individual women saying, hey, I think I'm gonna go out and try to vote today. It came from multiple places. There were men, of course, adding in their voices. There were civic organizations formed in town. We had our local newspaper, of course we have the university, and then we have the church. So organizations in Alfred, in 1892, the Women's Republican Association was formed. It was a chapter of a national organization, and its purpose was to unite women in political work and social influence. They're trying to maintain the principles of the Republic Party in the home, the state, and the nation. The Allen Civic Club, formed in 1908, it was a local club. It was named after or in honor of Jonathan and Abigail Allen. And their purpose was to collect and disseminate information on political and social problems, to use the ballot, undertake activities that further humanitarian legislation, with a focus on protecting the interests of women, children, and the home. The National League of Women Voters was formed in 1920, and the Alfred chapter formed the same year. It was a nonpartisan organization to promote, just trying to get people to just participate in government and education and to be aware of the issues on the ballot and to go out and vote. Alfred's reformers, most of them were members of the Seventh-day Baptist Church, and the church influence sort of across the board, certainly in the 19th century, was very strong. This is a section out of the 1887 Seventh-day Baptist Handbook, and it's saying the SDBs have been always in the front as reformers. Independence in thought was a basic tenet, is a basic tenet of the Seventh-day Baptist Church. And so it's saying that it can give rise to radical tendencies. And those of us familiar with Abigail Allen certainly know that being radical was important to her, is what she promoted. In 1858, Darwin Maxon, a member of the church and also a member of our faculty, he started advocating for women in the church to have the right to vote, which became a reality in 1874. So on lots of different levels, we've got women advocating for their rights and being allowed to do a variety of things. The Alfred Sun newspaper, if you read through the newspaper, certainly at the beginning of the 19th century or 20th century, 1900s, you see lots of articles on what was called the woman question, political cartoons that support the idea that women should vote, covering county conventions and different suffrage group meetings, you know, posting the reports in the paper, but just overall, you know, a supportive tone. So in 1917, women in the state did gain the right to vote, and this is out of the paper in early 1918. You know, saying that in a local village election, there were 79 votes cast, and of 79, 45 are cast by women. And you can see at the bottom, you know, it's saying the women are to be congratulated because they're showing the interest. So just again, little snapshots of what was happening here in town. At the university, certainly we have the faculty, the administration, advocating for and giving voice to the idea that women should be educated, that women should have certain rights, and suffrage is one of those. So I'm going to briefly mention the lyceums. Our early history of coeducation, again, is just a base support for some belief in the rights of women. And then campus speakers. So women's lyceums were basically student organizations, but they were unusual for the time because they were promoting the idea that women should have a public speaking role. And they would debate topics. And this is just a really short list, but I just want to illustrate early on, the ladies, the women on campus, supported by the administration, the town would come listen to these debates, community members would. You know, 1866, they're talking about that, and they have resolved in the affirmative that yes, the right of suffrage should be extended to lady. So just early on, a lot of conversation on campus, publicly supported, that really support, you know, again, you know, go women, yes, you should have rights, you should be able to vote. In 1876, one of the lyceums held a debate and they called it man suffrage. They acted as if they were in the year 2000. And they debated, you know, as if they were members of Congress, and they were saying, well, should the Constitution be changed to extend the right of suffrage to man, right? This is in 1876. They're already sort of flipping the coin and having these conversations. 1914, our commencement oration, every year there's a senior student who would give the commencement oration, given by female Lucille Stillman. And her oration, which we have the fortunate to have the whole text of, it was described later as a sane and common sense defense of the feminist movement. How many other colleges, you know, in the United States, so, you know, would have allowed a female to be the commencement oration speaker and then have it to be focused on the feminist movement in support of women? As Gary's already mentioned, you know, Susan B. Anthony came to campus, Elizabeth K. Stanton, Julie Ward Howe, Elizabeth Oak Smith, Caroline Dahl. So in the 19th century, we have very nationally prominent women coming to campus to speak. And again, it just shows the overall support for a lot of these early reform, or the 19th century reform movements. Moving on real quick to Abigail, be radical, rattled to the core, was a phrase of hers that our Women in Gender Studies program continues to use as their motto. Abigail was described by President Davis as an ardent promoter of all reforms, particular interest in advancing the culture and attainments for women. And her influence will be felt and esteemed at the university for many generations to come. And here we are, you know, almost 120 years later, still admiring Abigail. So I like to make sure we think of Abigail not in just a little, one little bubble like, yay, you know, go women's rights, but she was a wife, she was a mother, she was a teacher. She was fighting for women's rights and issues on many levels, not just suffrage. Mallory mentioned the labor. She focused a lot and thought about labor issues for women quite a bit. And she was certainly active in the temperance movement, aid societies trying to help orphans in New York City, freed slaves in their schools, a member of the church, strong abolitionist. She even ran meetings in her house for young mothers, and she hired female students in her house to give them employment. So on lots of levels. I mean, Abigail was a very engaging, complex woman who we very much admire. And so just examples, she was the first woman in Allegheny County that we know of in the 1840s to demand and receive equal pay. 1846, she starts the Alpha Delphine Society on campus, which is one of the earliest lyceums and opportunities for women in the country to think and speak publicly. 1853, she sees Susan B. Anthony speak. 20 years later, she's invited by Julie Ward Howe to speak in New York City. And then in 1887, she's leading 9 women to vote in her local election, visiting Elizabeth Cady Stanton in her home in New York. And then in 1900, 2 years before her death, she's invited to the gala in Washington, D.C. for the Women's Suffrage Association meeting, but she was honored as one of the band of early workers in the Reform suffrage movement. So I love it, Abigail so much. She's so admiring. And then when she passed away in 1902, her obituary appeared in the Rochester paper, in the Buffalo paper, and they're extolling her as a friend of Anthony and Stanton, and that she was a pioneer in her state for the political advancement of women. So we're super fortunate to have Abigail in our past. And I'm going to transition now to Becky, who's going to take us a little bit farther into Abigail.
Thank you, Lori. I'm one of those non-technicians, non-technology people. I'm not going to have any pictures. And I also want to note that while Abigail and Jonathan Allen created very important moments in the history of the women's movement and many other movements, Emrys has created a very important historic moment here. This is our first ever electronic Zoom Bergren Form. And so I have to say to everyone, welcome to the 21st century and thank you, Emrys. As Lori just said, when Abigail Allen passed away in 1902, in this tiny village, this very community where we are, she was hailed as a friend of Susan B. Anthony. She had been a special guest at Anthony's 80th birthday party, and she had with Anthony visited Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Abigail Allen gave a very warm account of that visit with Stanton, which along with her continued friendship with Anthony sustained her and her husband Jonathan in decades of effort to win the right for women to vote. In her passing, Abigail Allen, as Lori just said, was extolled as an early and ardent pioneer for the women and the women's suffrage movement. I'll go a little more specific than Lori did, which, she gave a great overarching biography of Abigail Allen's activities, but I want to take a minute to just explore why it was that a woman born in Allegheny County, New York in 1824 rose to be such a revolutionary, perhaps we could call her radical figure in the women's movement. There are likely 3 reasons. One is that in rural America at the time, there was pressure for social reform. And that reform movement took the forms of such things as abolition, temperance, women's rights, and so on. Gary's piece about states that gave rights to women to vote early on is very much an indication of that pressure for for reform in rural America. Also, an important social approach at the time was that it is natural for this world and for society for women and men to function together, to have equal rights and equal connections. And then there's a third one, and Lori mentioned this. Abigail Allen was born into a family that was Seventh-day Baptist. Jonathan Allen also was Seventh-day Baptist, and that denomination who settled this area and founded both the community of Alfred and Alfred University had very, very powerful influences on the women's rights movement in this area, and also such things as abolition and temperance. So just a little more information. For the pressure for reform I've talked about, but let's look at reason 2 for a moment. Living and reacting in the natural world of logic, reason, philosophy. In natural thought, men and women not only occupied the same sphere, it was thought that women and men were in separate spheres. They had separate duties, they had separate opportunities, separate responsibilities. But by the mid-19th century, there was this notion that it was natural that they operated or occupied the same sphere. So they built their lives together in shared endeavor out of mutual respect for one another and the hope for a good life. The natural sharing of all of these areas is one outcome, an important one for the Allens and for us here at Alfred University, is that women should be educated. Women should not be simply relegated to the home or taught the simplicity of just to read and write and figure household accounts, but definitely educated. And that education would also, or should also, lead to the full exercise of the right to vote. So we end up in the history of Alfred with education linked to or seen as a means to reform, and reform as a means to create a better society that welcomed everyone to participate, and those were radical ideas. The Seventh-day Baptists, Lori touched on these, and they are an interesting and fairly complex denomination, almost completely gone now, but they were egalitarians. They definitely believed that all people, all men and women, were equal regardless of social position, age, level of education, or perceived racial differences. There was mutuality in all areas of life, faith, labor, and certainly shared ideas and discourse. The women's societies, literary societies that Lori referred to, underline that. And that all should have equal access to an education, and that this was essential for that mutuality, that naturalness. By 1836, the entire faith as a denomination was committed to the abolition of slavery. Seventh-day Baptists were also firm believers in the notion that being educated leads to an independence of interpretation of Scripture, creating a denomination of educated freethinkers who resisted central control. Possibly one of the reasons that it's essentially dissolved into many other trends and social developments. This certainly created that environment for discourse. Baptism by immersion is certainly a central theme, a central tenet in any Baptist denomination. But for the Seventh-day Baptists, as with other Baptists, it was that you were educated, you studied, you had independent interpretation on issues of faith and society and politics, and therefore you did not enter the church as a member until you had been educated by yourself and by your peers and by your teachers, so that you professed your faith and your independence in interpretation, and you were baptized and entered on an equal footing with all members of the church who had preceded them. The Seventh-day Baptists worshiped on Saturday, holding that that was the day that was set aside by God for the rest and thought in faith. There was also a thread of the denomination that believed that at the beginning of the Christian era, that the Catholic Church, out of hatred to Jews, had moved the religious day from Saturday to Sunday. Also, there was some indication that Roman celebration of Saturn was also set for Saturday. So, you know, there's a lot of discussion there. But suffice it to say that this small group, probably never a group larger than 2,000 or 3,000 members through the 19th century. By the end of the 19th, about 10,000 in regular attendance in churches across the country. But in our era here in Alfred, we're down to something in the hundreds. But they spread across New England and into New York State and across the upper Midwest by the mid-19th century. Egalitarians seeking freedom for all, which they felt was natural, and having the right to read, think, and decide one's own faith and fate. And that assured that both Jonathan and Abigail saw the road to women's suffrage as the trail to full, as the trail to full equality before the law. The bright path was not only education, but co-education. And this is certainly what made Alfred early and unique. But defining co-education is as that of men and women learning, sharing ideas, creating plans and practices for the future in the same classroom, the same curriculum, with the same teachers at the same time. There's probably a really important fourth reason, and that is that Jonathan and Abigail as a couple set about to sustain all aspects of Alfred University's co-education in a radical way, keeping it natural, that is the natural association of men and women with one another. And it is natural that men and women are equal, and it's the 19th century, in the 19th century, a radical idea that led to the continued concept of co-education. They were quite a team. The promise of power and co-education led Abigail to New York City to present her arguments at the Women's Congress in October of 1873. For Abigail and educators at Alfred University, winning the right for women to vote was the most natural outcome and as well sustenance for co-education. An approach that had been in Alfred from its inception and would carry Alfred and other schools into the future of equal rights in all areas was co-education. That was also the title of her presentation at the Women's Congress in October of 1873. And it is this speech, I think, that has carried us forward into the development of the Women's and Gender Studies program with its motto. Her speech, by the way, from the length of it, probably ran in excess of an hour. So pull up a chair. No, I'm not going to read it all to you. Gary actually asked me that at one point in the planning of this. But her second paragraph is probably, for our purposes, the most important and the most enlightening. She says, any culture to be noblest must not only have its inspiration in harmony with great human and divine influences, but it must move on the high tide of human progress, keep abreast of the world's advanced movements. In one word, we must be radical. Radical to the core. She goes on to say, to all men and all women, the great historic characters whose memory humanity fondly cherishes were the radicals of their times, and those institutions have greatly blessed our race and have sprung from fundamental truths. So she's asking us all to consider that if we are for reform and if we are for coeducation, as well as through education, that we be radical. She also argues that there are 4 areas where Alfred has excelled, and this is toward the end of the speech, and that has continued to increase the value and the understanding of coeducation. First, she points out that because it is coeducational, Alfred has an advantage over other schools because siblings can attend together, sharing expenses, labor, and mutually caring for one another's needs in a family-like environment. And by the way, both Allens frequently referred to the notion that Alfred was a university founded by the poor, for the poor, and therefore the coeducation and the saving of money for a family was an essential part. Second, she points to scholarship that she says is engaged without artificial incentives. In other words, people are learning and studying simply for the joy and the information, as well as the independent interpretation of these ideas. So she said, we don't give prizes at Alfred. There are no prizes. We just all work hard. Her third point of success is that of order, and this is something that may kind of make people feel a little crimped, but we have to remember that she was speaking and working in her own time. That order in the college is preserved by the balance of men and women. And then my interpretation, who out of respect for one another maintain civility. But she referred to the fact, temperance, that there was no alcohol engaged in the education, and that everything was of a high moral tone and centered on the notion of family. Her fourth is that of culture, that men and women living together as family provide balance and emotional sustenance for one another. For the mid-19th century, these were indeed radical ideas in education. So let us, as people of Alfred, continue to be radical to the core. We must continue our investigations of the best of all humanity and the natural world in pursuit of truth and in pursuit of racial and social justice, and of course, education for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. I'm jumping right in here, and I'm actually moving us forward and talking about student voting patterns at Alfred University. We've been participating in a study for almost 10 years now. So we actually are part of the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement conducted by the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts, and it's the Tisch College of Civic Life. So really what we're talking about here, it's the only national study of college student voting. And we're actually able to get our data of how our students are doing and how we compare to other institutions. So this study is actually based on the voting records of more than 10 million students at more than 1,000 colleges and universities. They do not receive any information that could identify the student or how they work, but what they're really looking at are the enrollment records that we as an institution submit to the National Student Clearinghouse and publicly available voting files collected by Catalyst. So this study was actually launched in 2013 with 250 campuses. We were actually one of the first campuses, which is why our 2012 data is included in here. And so I thought it was really important for us to look from the presidential elections, and then I'll show you our midterm data. So in our 2016 elections, you can see we had a 42% voting rate, but you can see out of all institutions, we were a little bit low. All institutions were at 50.4. But again, our registration rate, we went from 65 to 75% of our students registered to vote. Again, it seems that we did really well in that way, but we didn't get the number of students actually then going out and voting as a result of that. So an area of growth that we have. I thought it was interesting, since we are focused on gender, to also look at our student data from the presidential elections, and you can see 2012 and 2016 there. And so you can see our women increased in their voting as well as our men, but our women still outperform our men in terms of voting. I want to bring us over now to our midterm elections. So we were really excited to see over 20 percentage points higher with our turnout at the higher for our 2018 midterm elections. So really a lot of work and focus that we've been doing. So as you can see, the registration rate, the voting rate of our registered students, again, still not off the charts, but we were happy with that. And so we are continuing to work in that way. Again, showing the gender breakdown by midterms. Just in being sensitive to time, there is a team of us, Corey Fecto, who's the art advisor and the service learning coordinator at the Career Development Center. We have 2 graduate students, Ashley Gomez from the College of Business and Shannon Marlott from the CSD program, and she is a graduate student at the Judson Leadership Center. We are working this semester, as well as we were working last spring, to really work on making sure that to help our students get registered to vote. So we will continue our partnerships with the NSLVE. We partner with the Allegheny County Board of Elections, the Cattaraugus Allegheny League of Women Voters, National Voter Registration Day. We participate in the All-In Campus Democracy, the Voter Friendly Campus program. And so we have continued to outreach. Some new initiatives that we're working on for this year, we were able to actually get some a Canvas course set up, and we're going to be very soon launching that. If anyone wants to add that Canvas course into any of their courses, and it actually talks about how to get registered to vote and the importance of voting. So Corey Fecto is actually developing that as we're working on that, so we're hopeful to have that in the next week or so. But again, Corey and I are people that can come in to speak about helping students get registered to vote. All of our work is done in a nonpartisan way, and just sort of wanted to give you a little bit about a snapshot of what's happening on our campus. If anyone is interested in that NSLVE data, it does break it down by Carnegie classification, by age, educational level, enrollment status, race and ethnicity, field of study. So it's a really fascinating, large report that I couldn't condense into just a couple of minutes, but you know, please let me know, and I'm happy to share that. So we have those 2 comparison reports, and we will continue to work with them and to see how our numbers can grow. And with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to Dr. Ostrower for any questions or final remarks.
Gary, you're muted. You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? You know, we've covered a lot of territory. It's already well past 1 o'clock. So I don't know whether there are any chat comments here. I see one, which is from Tim Nichols. What was the source for that founded by the poor for the poor? I like that reference.
I'll send the actual date and time and all that sort of thing to Tim and anyone else who's interested. But it was a theme often repeated, especially in the first 30 or 40 years of the institution.
And the other thing I would want to mention is just, and it goes back in a sense to what Mallory and what I was talking about in respect specifically to suffrage and the 19th Amendment, is that, you know, it took 70 years really from 1848 when the idea is really first formally introduced until 1920, 72 years before you finally had that amendment. In other words, you know, sometimes we got to be patient. And in that case, if they weren't patient, they would have been, you know, extremely disappointed. Susan B. Anthony died, I believe, about 1902. I think that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, about 4 years later, they were involved in this process for a long, long time, but their work was carried on by others, people like Carrie Catt and Alice Paul. Alice Paul headed up what was initially called the Congressional Caucus and then became the National Women's Party, which still exists to this very, very day. Absolutely single-minded, like Anthony, absolutely single-minded in their focus. And if they were not, I'm not sure that we would have had suffrage in 1920. The other point I would make is that there was a lot of fractiousness. Even in 1869, for instance, the National Women's Suffrage Association split into two different organizations, one led by Susan B. Anthony and the other led by, I believe it was Lucy Stone at that time. There was a good deal of factionalism. It's not as if, you know, this all proceeds slowly, and unfortunately we just don't have the time to really develop much of that. Be it as it may, I want to thank the panel members for their contributions. We covered a lot of ground in a number of different areas, and if you have any questions about this, just shoot any of us an email. I think that we'd be more than happy to continue the discussion.
But it's also true, I've unmuted everyone, so if anyone does have something to say right now, they can say it. That is, I've given everyone the right to unmute themselves, I should say.
I just say thank you to all of you. That was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for the time you put into preparing that for us. It was great.
And it was recorded. So if anyone wants to listen to it, you know, afterwards, they have the opportunity to do it.
Tricia, I have a question for you. Which is not really a history question. It's I read, and you might not know the answer, but I read an article in the New York Times this morning about using libraries to expand voting by, you know, putting ballot boxes, very secure ballot boxes, in libraries well in advance of elections. And I wondered if, and the article sort of said this is a way to really expand people's opportunity to vote. And I wondered if that was possible in our region.
I think that's a great question. I think what's really actually more fascinating is the mail-in voting that, and really kind of where we fall on that, particularly as a state. And we've been doing, there's been lots of late decisions on voting, which makes it very challenging for county boards of elections to pivot basically for the state. You know, there are some states where they actually send a ballot to every registered voter. So you receive it in your mailbox so that you can actually do the voting, and that's happening. And there's some really interesting things out there, but it's going to be very interesting to see how this election runs and what the voter turnout is going to be, because I think we have a long way to go to really make it easy and convenient for everyone to vote.
Well, if no one has any more questions, I'd like to thank the panelists for a wonderful, informative presentation, and remind you all that there'll be another Bergren Forum in 2 weeks' time, and see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.